Growing up in South Carolina, I was an all-state athlete in high school. I captained the football team, the basketball team, the baseball team, had numerous scholarship offers. But I said, I'm not going to college. I'm going to drink beer, chase girls. That's the life. And I began to go to nightclubs. And in there I consorted with all the scum. I met the prostitutes, the drug addicts, the ex-convicts, you name it, they were there. And young people, it took me 1 year to destroy my life. 1 year. I met two men in a nightclub. We go to Atlanta, Georgia, where I now live. We decided to party, to smoke dope, have fun. So we hit all the night scenes for 1 week. We checked out of the motel to go back to North Carolina. And my two friends says, let's go by and visit these girls that we had met in this apartment complex. So we did that, but the girls weren't there. My two friends left my car and went a block and a half down the street and decided to rob a supermarket. They pulled guns on 12 people and told the manager to open a safe. He was getting ready to do that when an innocent bystander was standing there, and he pulled a pistol out of his belt to shoot them, to become a hero. But one of them shot him first. And they ran, came back to where I was, a block and a half away, and they said, drive, drive, we shot a man. The worst mistake I've ever made in my life was driving them back to North Carolina. En route back to North Carolina, I asked them what happened, and they told me, and I said, well, did you kill the man? They said, no, he was standing when we left. We're sure he'd be all right. Well, they got out of my car. I never saw them again for 1 year. I was arrested by the FBI. I was charged with armed robbery and murder. The man had died 5 minutes later. Well, I go on trial for my life, the electric chair in Atlanta, Georgia. My two so-called friends that I haven't seen during this year came in that courtroom, took the witness stand against me, testified they were never tried in a court of law. I was given 2 life sentences, given mercy. I stood in front of that judge that day and heard the saddest words I've ever heard in my life. He said, young man, for the crime of robbery, he said, I sentence you to the state penitentiary at hard labor for the rest of your life. And he said, for the crime of murder, I sentence you to the rest of your natural life in the state penitentiary at hard labor. They shackled me down. They took me over to Fulton County Jail, put me in an 8 by 10 foot cell. And I spent over 2 years, and finally I lost my last appeal, and 2 old guards came. They shackled my ankles, they put a chain around my waist and handcuffed my hand to that chain and took me to Georgia State Penitentiary. I'll never forget that day as I stood in front of that big, massive prison. As I started to walk through the door, one of the old guards looked at me and he said, young man, how much time do you have? I said, I have 2 life sentences, sir. He said, how much time have you done on it? I said, I'm just starting out. He said, young man, take a good look at the front door of the prison, because you'll die there. You will never be free again. I looked back over my shoulder. I began to cry. You know why? I believed him. As I looked back that day, there was no one to say, I love you, I care about you. And I walked through that door, and they put me in a small dormitory that the federal government says 45 men was capacity for. That day, I was the 115th person to enter that room. The beds were triple decked, 18 inches apart for the murderers, the robbers, the rapists that are unwillingly thrust together under those conditions. Young people, don't feel sorry for me. I got what I deserved. I consorted with the scum of the earth, and I became as they were. I tell you today that who you associate with in life will determine the outcome of your life, good or bad. Please know that. Be aware of the little things, young people. You can go to prison, and the little things are so important. Let me give you an illustration that I think is the best illustration I could ever use to show you that you can wreck your life in a period of 1 day. In 1972, the worst year in my life, I had been in prison for 3 years, and I was in a fight one day. I was going to be operated on. The door opens, out walks a man. The minute I looked at him, I know who he was. His name was Sheephead. He had been in so many fights in prison that every facial bone had been broken. He looked like a sheep. They called him Sheephead. And I looked at him and I said, sir, are all the stories true that I've heard about you? He said, you ain't heard nothing yet. Well, they found out that he had cancer. They put him in the hospital unit where I worked, and each day I would go over and talk to him. And I heard the most unusual story, and I know it to be true. When he was 16 years old, he broke into a store. He stole a Pepsi-Cola and a pack of crackers. That's all he took. They gave him a 1-year sentence and sent him to Georgia State Penitentiary. He had been there for several months when they were out on shotgun detail, and 2 old inmates said, young boy, you grab the gun from that guard. We'll grab it from this guard and we'll escape. Now, out of fear, he grabs the gun, but they don't get the gun from the other guard. So he shoots that guard, kills him, paralyzes the other one for life. They sentence him to die in the electric chair. He's on death row 8.5 years. The governor commutes his sentence to life. They put him in inmate population. In 1975, I stood in front of a lonely prison cell and I watched him die with cancer. And I cried. You know why? That man had been there 34 years. He had killed one guard, paralyzed another one. He'd killed 17 inmates. He was a drug addict, a homosexual. And he was the most violent man that's ever walked this earth. And one night in a fight, he took a meat cleaver, chopped a guy up, flushed him down the john, got everything down but his skull. That's how violent he had become. And I cried that day. You know why? Not because he had died, because he had never lived. It began with a Pepsi-Cola and a pack of crackers. It ended with his life 34 years later. A guard came to my cell one day and opened that door after 5 years. He said, "You have a visit." I said, "I don't want to see anyone." He said, "You're going to see who it is or we're going to put you in the hole." Well, I went to see who it was. And as I turned the corner, there stood my brother. I asked him how he'd found me after 5 years. He said that a neighbor in South Carolina where he lived went in a beauty parlor looking through some old magazines, saw my picture in a True Detective magazine, a 5-year-old magazine. He said, "That's how I found you." Well, it was a great day in my life as my brother told me about my mom, my family, and then he left. And they put me back in that prison cell on top of that prison. And for the first time in 5 years, I realized why I was there. And I cried that night as I thought of my life. I thought about how alcohol, other drugs, negative peer pressure, always associating with the wrong kinds of people. And I thought about how I'd had a bad attitude all my life. And when you get older, you're going to find out that you're your own worst enemy and that most of you have gone through life with a bad attitude. I had the worst attitude of anyone I've ever known, and a teacher in the 8th grade told me that, and I said, "What do you know?" She knew a lot. I wish I'd listened, and many times lying in a prison cell, I'd remember things that my parents, my teachers, my coaches had shared with me. And I said, if only I had listened. So please work on your attitude and develop that and learn how to love. I was brought up in South Carolina where I learned to hate black people. I didn't go to school with black people, and I was taught that they weren't my equal. I go off to college, there was no blacks there, and then I go to prison where there's 2 blacks for every white. And in prison, there's a lot of racial tension. You see, I was ignorant. I had been taught wrong. And I had been in prison for 5 years. And we were the last prison in America to integrate. And one day the warden sent for me and he said, "We have until 4 o'clock today to integrate this prison. Go up to your cell, take that Puerto Rican and that white guy, move them out and get you a black guy." I said, "You got to be kidding. I got 2 life sentences. I got to spend the rest of my life with a black guy." So he said, "I'm going to give you a chance to select the one you want." So I went throughout the prison. I'd go up to these black guys and I said, "Hey, do you take a bath?" He said, "Do you?" And I said, "Well, listen, I got to put one of y'all in my cell," and I called my cell the penthouse. Now, I love my cell. It was my home. I would clean it. I would paint the floor. I had my bed painted black, my walls 7 different colors, my commode was painted red. So I call it the penthouse, sharpest cell in prison. So everybody wanted to go to that clean cell. So I chose this black guy. He's the greatest athlete I've ever known. He was a decent guy, and he said, "Yeah, I'll move in." I said, "Okay, one thing. Nobody bothers my stuff. I won't bother yours. I'll share everything I got with you, but I don't steal, you don't steal." So they put us in this 8 by 10 foot cell, slammed the door. There's 18 inches of space between the beds. There we sit staring at each other. He looked at me and I looked at him and I said, "You don't like me, do you?" He said, "No." He said, "You don't like me, do you?" And I said, "I hate your guts." He looked at me and he says, "Why do you hate me?" I thought I would have had 50 reasons to give him. I couldn't think of one. And I said, "Cause you black." He said, "That's right. You hate me because of the color of my skin." He says, "I don't hate you because you're white. I hate you because you'd be sorry in any color." I've never had to deal with anything like that in my life. And I looked at him and I said, "Listen, I'm sorry. I'm wrong. I've been taught wrong all my life, and I don't know how to make it right with you, but I'll do anything on earth to make it right." To make a long story short, that man became my closest friend as we spent 3 years in that cell. We shared everything we had, Every time you saw one, you saw the other. They call us salt and pepper. And one night, some black Muslims came up to kill some friends in another cell and I guess to attack me. And my friend stood up and tried to reason with him. And they stabbed him in the back 7 times. They rushed him off to the hospital to die. They called his mother and they said he won't live through the night. They slammed that door and I took a mop and I started mopping up that blood of my friend. And I cried as I looked at that red blood because it's the same color of mine. And I got on my knees and prayed for that boy. And I said, don't let him die. He lived, he came back to that prison. And the day I left, he was standing at the fence and he hauled out through that fence. He says, I love you, Harold. I love you. All the inmates were there, the guards, the warden. And I looked back at him and I says, I love you too. I'll be back. I went back 55 times. I carried him all the food he could eat. And I was there the day that he walked through that door. But before he got out, I carried boys from this orphanage where I worked, troubled kids back there, and he would take off his shirt and show them his back where he'd been stabbed 7 times. That's what love is all about. You develop a good attitude and learn to love. March the 14th, 1978, I walked out of the prison on parole, went back to South Carolina, worked at an orphanage for 1 year, then I enrolled in college. I graduated May the 16th, 1981, and the day before I graduated, the governor of Georgia and the Pardons and Parole Board gave me a complete pardon. They did away with the crime I'd been charged with for 13 years, restored my rights as a citizen of the United States. I'm now free, I can vote. I'm totally free. And I dedicated my life to helping young people, to try to keep them from making the mistakes I've made in life. And that's my purpose in being here tonight, to try to give you some principles to apply to your lives to avoid making the mistakes I've made in mine. Where did it begin? It began with alcohol. As a sophomore in high school, I got drunk for the first time. I was with 2 seniors. They handed me a vodka bottle and said, take a drink. I knew it was wrong, but I drank it. It was the awfulest tasting stuff I've ever tasted in my life. I turned around, threw up, but when they passed it around again, I took another drink. Why? Because I wanted to be accepted. I wanted them to like me. You see, I had low self-esteem. I didn't like myself, and I wanted to be accepted. And young people, alcohol will wreck your life. A friend of mine shared an article with me that was in the local newspaper in the town he lived in. 2 16-year-old boys without speeding in an automobile. There was an accident. Both were killed. The highway patrolman that investigated that accident had the very difficult job of going to the parents and telling them that the sons were dead. He found a liquor bottle in the back seat of the car. He knocks on the door. One of the dads comes to the door and he said, sir, I regret to inform you, but your son is dead. And sir, I regret to inform you, but he was under the influence of alcohol. We found a liquor bottle in the back seat. The man became hysterical. He says, I would kill the man that sold my son alcohol. I would choke him to death with my bare hands, he said. So he became so hysterical, he goes over to the liquor cabinet to get him a drink to settle his nerves. He opens the liquor cabinet. There was a note. It said, Dear Dad, I took a 5th of liquor with me because I knew you wouldn't mind. That man had killed his son. When I think of drugs and alcohol, I guess I think of marijuana as well, because marijuana is the second most preferred drug by teenagers. 5 marijuana joints is equivalent to 112 tobacco cigarettes in your lungs. And the great danger about marijuana is you don't know what you're getting. You see, you buy it from the drug pusher and he's the scum of the earth. He would sell his soul for the almighty dollar. When I think of drugs, I'm reminded of Georgia State Penitentiary and the experiences I had there. I have seen men there inject drugs into their veins. I've seen them amputate their arms, their legs, lose their eyesight. Watched a 19-year-old boy sniff glue out of a bread sack. He went into a coma, became a vegetable. He stayed that way 6 months before he died. They buried him in the prison graveyard because no one wanted his body. The most horrible thing I've ever seen in my life, there was a black man, 20 years old, that slept in the bunk next to mine, 18 inches away. I watched 2 men come up one night to that bunk and hold him down, while a third guy came up with a knife and stabbed his eyes out. The next day they said, why did we do it? He was our friend. They thought that he had ratted out a drug transaction they were involved in. It was proven the next day he was totally innocent. That was 1972. He is blind today. You don't want to mess with that stuff, and I promise you don't want to go to prison. I was visiting two friends in 1979, and I heard them talking about a young boy. They said that he had broken in a drugstore, that he had taken the drugs, tried to kill himself, OD'd, they saved his life, pumped out his stomach, that he was in the local jail, that he comes from a wealthy family, but his family had disowned him, that he'd been in so much trouble, kicked out of every school in the county. I went to that jail, and I asked to see that young boy, and they locked him in a small room with me. He was the most filthy looking sight I've ever seen. You could smell him as he came up to you. And he looked at me and he said, "Sir, everybody thinks I smoke marijuana, but I've been snorting cocaine since I was 13 years old. You see, I hate my dad. He gives me the money to buy it. He didn't care about me. And I'd kill him today if I could get to him. I have no reason to live," he said. I looked at him and I said, "Son, I want to tell you something. I don't know you, Father, but I care about you very much. And I'm going to get you turned over to me for 24 hours, and I'm going to carry you to Georgia State Penitentiary. I want you to see the place you're going to spend the rest of your life if you continue the lifestyle you're living." Well, arrangements were made, and they turned him over to me for 24 hours. I called the warden, and I asked him if I could see three men that were there. I call them the unholy three. The first man that came down was Big Head Yank. He had been there 19 years. It's August the 14th, 1979. It's hot in South Georgia. He has on a sweatshirt, he has a shirt over that, has on a prison jacket, a prison hat, dark glasses, and a scarf around his neck. And he walked up and says, "Hey, punk, what's your name?" And the boy almost forgot his name. He said, "Mama," and repeated his name. He said, "Sit down, boy." He looked over at the boy and he said, "Boy, how old are you?" He said, "17, sir." He said, "When I was your age, I done come to prison for murder. I done robbed a bank. I rented a motel, filled it up with women, and I've done come here and killed 3 teenagers just like you, boy." And reached in his pocket and pulled out 3 indictments that he had carried around for 19 years. He looked at him and says, "Get off my foot." He said, "Yes, sir." He wasn't even on his foot. Well, directly he left, I called down another. And he sat there and he looked at this young boy and he said, "Son, I want to tell you about my life. You see, at age 10, I killed my mother. I beat her to death with a baseball bat. I've been here 12 years. I've never received a letter. I'll never receive one probably. The only friend I have in the world is Harold. I deserve to die in prison. Son, please, you don't want this kind of life. And I want you to leave here today, and I want you to listen to Harold. He cares about you." And he turned and walked away. I had saved the best to last. His name was Big Mac. He had been in prison 24 years. He weighed about 250 pounds, had tattoos all over him. He had stab wounds all over him. He was a drug addict. He was a homosexual. He walked up to him and grabbed him and lifted him off the floor and said, "Punk, what's your name?" He forgot his name again. He looked at him and reached over and he said, "Listen to me. I don't like Morris. I never have. And I want you to leave here today, and I want you to go out, and I want you to smoke dope. I want you to shoot dope. I want you to rob, steal, murder. Do it all, son, because then you're coming back here." And he says, "I'm going to make you my boy. You're cute." And he lifted him off the floor and kissed him. That young boy went crazy. He ran to the door and said, "Let me out, let me out." And they let him out. All the inmates and the guards were laughing. I was about to crack up myself. I go out to the car, and he's sitting there. I got in the car. I didn't say a word for about 5 minutes. And Rick looked at me and he was crying. He said, "Mr. Morris, will you help me?" Well, I went to his family. They got him probation. He was tested for drugs once a week. We got him back in school. 4 years later, I was sitting in my apartment in South Carolina. There was a knock on the door, and there he stood. He came over and he hugged my neck and said, "Mr. Morris, I'll never forget Big Mac. And because of those men that day, my life has changed. And I'm thinking about going into ministry." Drugs will wreck your life, young people. Know that, please. Know that it's a one-way street going nowhere, please. And if you've started, stop. If you haven't, don't start. There's another problem I face as a teenager, problems that you face today, that is handling peer pressure and dealing with acceptance. You think that group acceptance is the most important thing in your life, but the need is for individuals to stand and be men and women, to stand for what they believe in, to be leaders in that school. That's the great need. And it's amazing how peer pressure affects the guys differently from the girls. One method the guys use is material things. They feel that way they'll be accepted. Anyone that will accept you because of what you own is not your friend. And then boys turned to athletics. That was the route I chose. Now, athletics is good. It's meant a lot in my life. I think it teaches character, but athletics is not the most important thing. Being a student is far more important. I look at my life today, and I realize that when I was in school, I never prepared myself for the game of life. And that's the most important one of all, the game of life. With the girls, it's totally different. To girls, beauty is the most important thing. Appearance is so important. Now, when I was in high school, I was the meanest student there. One day I told this girl, I said, you ugly. And she looked at me and she said, well, beauty is only skin deep. And I said, honey, with you, ugly goes all the way to the bone. But I saw her not long ago. You know what she said? She's married, she has 2 kids. She always had a beautiful personality. She had character. She cared about her appearance. And to me, she is indeed beautiful. So that equation, beauty versus happiness, doesn't always work. And then there's another problem they face. And that's lowering their standards to get a date. So many girls feel that they have to play the dating game, and they'll do anything to get a date. They'll even lower their standards. And girls, let me tell you what to look for in these guys when you go out on a date. See, these sorry rascals will take you out, and they'll park, and he thinks he's a cool dude in the groove. He thinks he's king cool, and he'll look over at you and he'll say, baby, you know what you are? And you'll say, what? He'll say, you're a TF. You'll say, what in the world is a TF? He said, you're a total fox. You'll say, golly, he's nice. And then he'll look at you and he'll say, it ain't gonna be long before you be a UBM. And you'll say, well, what in the world is a UBM? He'll say, a ultra bad mama. Oh, you'll say, golly, he is king cool. And then the sorry rascal he's setting you up. He will look at you and he'll say, if you love me, prove your love. He doesn't love you. Anyone that'll ask you to prove your love doesn't love you. He's taking you to be the biggest fool, the most gullible fool that ever walked this earth. You figure it out for yourself. What is he asking you to do when he says prove your love? He's asking you to surrender your virtue, throw away your self-respect, risk the loss of your precious reputation, and risk getting in trouble, and that is not love. He doesn't care what's best for you, because anyone that loves you wants what's best for you. Let me tell you how you deal with that character. Carry your Bible with you. Put it on the seat between you. By the time he crawls over Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, he's worn out. Now, he might not ask you out again, but he's doing you a favor. But you don't need a character like that. You see, he's a Romeo. He's a Don Juan. And that's not what you need. You see, all the girls want a macho man. All the guys want a macho girl. But that's not what you need. Here's what you need. You need a nacho man and a nacho girl. That's one that'll stand up and say, I'm nacho man, I'm nacho girl, with a lot of cheese on it. So you start looking for a nacho and a nacho. Because let me tell you about that sorry rascal. After he gets what he wants, he'll move on to someone else and brag about his conquest. He doesn't care about you. Please, no alcohol, drugs, immoral sex. How do you resist peer pressure? I'll tell you how. First of all, you be selective in who you should associate with. You choose a group that's going somewhere. I promise you, if you choose the wrong group, it will determine the outcome of your life, good or bad. And secondly, take a stand and learn to say a 2-letter word, N-O. At Georgia State Penitentiary, I quit drugs. One day, 2 guys came up to my bunk and said, hey man, you want to smoke some dope? I said, I'm through. They said, yeah, you'll be back. For the first time, I had taken a stand. I had said no. They left me alone after a period of time. And if you'll learn to say no, they'll leave you alone. And there's another problem that you face. And it's a major problem in young people's lives these days, and it's that of suicide. 6,000 teenagers, American teenagers, committed suicide in this country last year. 500,000 others attempted suicide. At Georgia State Penitentiary, I watched 3 teenage boys commit suicide. They rolled their bodies right in front of my cell, and I watched them carry the bodies away. And I remember one of them, before he hung himself, he said to me in a cell, I couldn't see him. He told me that he was going to take his life. And I've got to live with the fact that I didn't try to help that young boy. But I cried the day they rolled his body in front of my cell. You know why? Because I was suicidal. I hung on the bars one night to see if my feet would hit the floor. I just saw no reason to live. I said, I can never endure prison. I can never do these sentences. There is no hope for the future. But I'm so thankful that in the darkest hour of my life, I made a decision. I made a decision that life is indeed precious. I was going to fight for my life. And that's the reason I'm free today. And I'm so thankful for that, young people. You feel many times that there's no hope, no one cares. And I know the loneliness you go through. I know the confusion you go through. I know the sexual pressures. I know your vulnerability to drugs and other problems. But no matter what the problem, suicide is not the answer. It is not the answer. And many young people have shared with me their deep frustrations because they can't communicate with their parents. And many have shared with me that they have no one whom they can turn to, but I tell you there is. And you're going to find out, just like I found out, that if you'll give your teachers and your parents, your pastors, if you'll give them a chance, they love you, they care for you, they don't have all the answers, but they'll try to help you. There are a lot of people that care very much about you. Suicide is not the answer. So tonight you have two decisions to make. Number one, you can say, sir, everything you've said sounds good, but that's not for me. You see, I'm young and I want to live, and maybe when I get your age one day, I might think about those things you've talked about tonight. But for now, I want to live my life the way I want to live it, and I want to have fun, and fun to me means committing immoral sex acts, drinking alcohol, smoking dope. That to me is fun, and I want to do my thing, and sir, you're a loser. I don't care about what you've said. You can make that decision, or secondly, tonight you can say, sir, thank you. No alcohol, drugs, immoral sex for me. I'm keeping my body pure for one man, one woman, and I thank you for coming, and I won't ever forget what you've said. Tonight as I close, I want to give you someone to pay in your life after as we close. Young people at Georgia State Penitentiary, at a lonely prison fence, a 12-year-old boy walked up. And he's the greatest example of positive peer pressure that I've ever known. And he looked at me through that prison fence. He said, hey man, I'm not scared of you. I said, come on this side of the fence and say that. Well, I wouldn't have hurt him for anything in the world. But that young boy told me that he loved me. He said, I believe in you. You're not a murderer. No one believed in me but that young boy. And practically every day he would come up to that fence. And he was my whole life. I would look forward to him coming to that fence. One day he asked me if I would go to his high school and speak. It was about 20 miles from the prison. I felt he was going to bust me out of the joint, in order to go. I said, how am I going to go? But he went to the warden, and he begged the warden to let me go to his high school. Finally, the warden gave in, and I went to that high school. I'll never forget it. I stood there with my prison clothes on, and that young boy got up and introduced me. And what he said, I'll never forget. He said, students, I want you to know that I care about you. And this old man ain't much to look at, but he's my friend, and he's taught me a great deal. And I care very much about you, and some of you are wrecking your lives, and you know it. You're using drugs, alcohol, and you're committing immoral sex acts. Please listen to this man. 45 minutes from now, he will leave here. He will go back to Georgia State Penitentiary. That door will slam. He will die there. It's real, he said. I couldn't believe that. I got up that day, I was scared to death, and I spoke to those young people, and I left. That young boy became a very much part of my life. He is my closest friend, and it's meant more in my life than anyone on this earth. He always had a old rubber basketball pounded in the ground. He said, my goal in life is to be the greatest basketball player in the world. I said, well, I was an all-state player, I'll help you. So he'd throw the ball across the fence. I'd make him dribble up and down the road, round the guard tower, between his legs. This goes on for a period of time. One day he comes to that fence and breaks my heart. He said, my dad's moved away. We bought a house in town. I won't be seeing you anymore. He had become my whole life. I didn't let him see me cry standing there. And I watched him walk away. One day I had to tell me that I had a visit. I go to the lobby. His mother was standing there. She said, tonight his basketball team is in the state finals. The game's going to be on the radio. He wants you to listen. Boy, I couldn't wait to hear him that night. He was wearing number 30, my own number. There was 3 seconds left in the game. The score is tied. His team has the ball. They call timeout. They set up one last shot. He takes a shot and he misses. The game goes at overtime, but they win in overtime. He was chosen the outstanding player. He had scored 27 points, and they interviewed him on the radio. That young boy came to that prison to see me the day before I left. Except he's not little anymore then. He could dunk a basketball. And he hugged my neck and he said, I want to thank you for being the brother I've never had. I said, I want to thank you for the impact you've had on my life. And when you're looking for someone to pattern your life after, young people, I want to give him to you. And that 12-year-old boy is no longer 12. He's 25 years old. He's here tonight, and I'm going to ask him to stand right over here. And that's who you need to pattern your life after. And if you will, I tell you, young people, your life won't ever be the same. I want to thank you for letting me come tonight, young people. I'll never forget you. I thank God for your lives. Hope and pray that you will take a stand with your life, learn to love, and if you will, the teenage years will be the greatest years of all. I'll be standing down front, and if ever you want to talk to me, I'd love to meet you. It's been a pleasure. God bless each and every one of you.